President Obama asked Congress to authorize use of military force against Syria in August to punish the regime's use of chemical weapons against civilians. 100 senators and 435 members of Congress offered opinions. Only 18 of us voted. The 18 of us who serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee came back early from a recess, had a vigorous debate, had a vote. By a vote of 10 to 8, essentially, we came down on the side of using military force. That vote did not need to be taken on the Senate floor or House ultimately, because in the aftermath of that vote, there was the diplomatic opening with Syria to explore the destruction of the chemical weapons. But I want to talk about that vote and what I learned from it. I voted for the use of military force in Syria for a variety of reasons. My reasons are less important than what it says about the United States' posture now, that a vote on that issue was so close. The use of chemical weapons against civilians is not a complicated thing. It is something, an international norm that has been part of international law since the 1920s. Why was a vote on that so close? And I want to just describe that briefly, and then we can, in the Q&A, offer other dimensions. First, the atrocities in Syria, because of the horrific crimes of the Assad regime, do call on the sympathies of every person in the world. And military action is not the only thing that is needed. First, there is a significant humanitarian crisis, and I very much appreciate the point that was made earlier. If we've acted diplomatically on chemical weapons, can't we act with the same degree of international passion to make sure that humanitarian aid is sufficient and gets to where it needs to go? The United States is the largest provider of humanitarian aid to Syrian refugees. We will provide more. But we do feel like we do need to act more in concert with other nations to make sure that the international community can enforce the distribution of aid over the obstacles currently being imposed by the Assad regime. Second, the United States is active in vigorous diplomacy, first surrounding the destruction of the chemical weapons stockpile, one of the largest stockpiles in the world, not even really declared. There had been efforts since 1992 when the Chemical Weapons Convention was updated to get Syria to become part of that convention. The destruction of a chemical weapons stockpile of this size in the midst of a civil war is no simple thing. It's a significant accomplishment. It does change the equation to some degree on the battlefield, but more broadly, the destruction of this stockpile is an important factor in the safety of the region going forward. But let's set aside diplomacy, Geneva II starting in January, and that's going to be critically important, and humanitarian, and now just talk about military. Because to the degree there has been frustration, I know, with the United States with respect to Syria, it's largely been around the question of the United States' support or lack of support for military support for the opposition to the Assad regime. And as somebody who participated in that debate and vote in August, I just want to offer my thoughts. Much about Syria is complicated. The humanitarian crisis, though, is simple. And Americans are sympathetic people. When there's a humanitarian crisis, we have a natural sympathy. When there's a typhoon in the Philippines, we act immediately, and the American public wants us to act. But when it comes to the use of military force, and particularly military force in this instance, even to support a proposition as clear as you shouldn't use chemical weapons against civilians, in Congress, it was a tough vote. It was a challenging vote. Why was it tough and challenging? It was tough and challenging because of what members of Congress were hearing from the American public. I voted for the use of military force, but I will be honest. The calls from Virginians, one of the most military states in the country, into my office were overwhelmingly against the vote that I cast, suggesting that we shouldn't use military force even in support of that principle. And I think it's important to try to understand why, because these reasons have answers, but it helps us to understand what they are. Last night I was on the opening debate panel about issues generally in the region, and a friend on the panel said, used the phrase war weariness in the United States. And that is a phrase that has some traction and some meaning, and yet it can obscure some more specific emotions that I want to describe briefly. what was it about that vote, and what was it about the American public's reaction that made the vote so close? I think there are four elements that made this a close vote, a difficult proposition at that moment in time. First, there is a skepticism in the American public about whether American military action in this region, in circumstances like this, can make a positive difference. It's not a skepticism about our military. It's not a skepticism about their valor and their capacity. It's a skepticism about whether military action, particularly as opposed to humanitarian or diplomatic, can actually move the needle, can change the circumstance for the good. And the American public is skeptical about it. And it's not just the American public. I was with some of you 3 weeks ago at a security conference in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and global polling of 20,000 individuals in 24 countries on all continents of the world had just been done by a polling organization of international credibility. And they discovered across the globe a skepticism about engagement in military activity along the lines of, we're not sure that it will accomplish good. There is a sense that it has to be done on occasion, that justice requires it on occasion, but really regardless of country and regardless of economic circumstance, there's a skepticism about whether military action can promote a positive outcome. So those of us who think that military action has a place in a particular challenge like Syria, the burden is on our shoulders to demonstrate that it can have a positive outcome. Second, a peculiarly American concern that was expressed in connection with the Syrian vote, which is essentially a subset of the first, is will our action, will our engagement at a military level, providing military support, be appreciated? Will it be appreciated? Will it be valued? Or will it be devalued? This is not just a matter of kind of will folks like us if we do it. It is also a subset of that question of if it's not appreciated, then maybe it's not that valuable. Maybe it doesn't make the difference that it should. The United States has experience in this regard that's recent experience. Many years of investment in Iraq, in our treasure, but in our time and our resources, in the lives of our young people. At the end of military activity in Iraq, the United States was willing to stay under some capacity, the military, to provide some services or support for reconstruction going forward. That was not desired by the Iraqi people or government. And that was their right to say that, no, let's make a clean break, you should be elsewhere. And yet, we derived a message from that. We're now engaged after 12 years in drawing down our forces in Afghanistan and in trying to negotiate a status of force agreement post-2014 with the Afghanistan government. We get a sense from the Afghan people and from many of the leadership class that they would desire us to remain in some capacity, but the current president of Afghanistan is prone to using phrases like occupiers to describe the American military. And again, the American public draws a lesson from that. Is our active military presence and engagement desired or not? And that feeds back into the question of whether it's likely to do any good or not. A third important question for the United States in wrestling with Syria is, will we have partners or not? How many partners will we have? The more partners, the more validation. The more partners, the more likelihood of success. When the president stepped out and said, we will use military force to enforce this international norm, there were partners. But there were partners that I could count on the fingers of one hand. There weren't other nations stepping forward for the proposition that use of chemical weapons in this circumstance was wrong and wrong enough to justify military action. And finally, the question, and I think this one will be a significant one. I had a very strong meeting with leaders of the Syrian opposition this morning. One of the great features of this dialogue is the opportunity to have these bilateral discussions, John. But the last question that we wrestle with is, the regime of Assad is horrible. What's the alternative? And many of the questions that were posed and many of the reasons elaborated by my colleagues who voted against military action were largely along the continuum of we can't trust the opposition. A very prominent voice in the Senate on the Republican side, although this is not a partisan issue. The vote was not partisan at all. But a very prominent member critiqued President Obama for wanting to use military force against the Assad regime and said, why would you, through airstrikes, try to become al-Qaeda's air force? That was the phrase that was used by a member of the Senate on the Foreign Relations Commission to vote against military action. Now, that's my description of sort of why it was close, but I think these four questions are questions that we will always be wrestling with in the United States now around the questions of military engagement. Can we make a difference? Will our actions be appreciated? Will we have partners? And what's the alternative? Those are questions that don't apply just to Syria, but will probably apply to our analysis of any situation that would require use of the American military force. Each of those have answers. Each of those can be answered. There are circumstances that would compel a positive answer to all those four, but if those of us in policy positions cannot provide the answers, we will face a skeptical public, as we did, and a skeptical vote, as we did in late August. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Senator, thank you very much. That was a very crisp presentation, and it bordered on the announcement of the Kaine doctrine for the use of military force that now appears to have four elements, which if a significant number of those four elements are absent, then the possibility of mustering public support for military action may be absent. So I think people should take note of those four elements and see if they persist as the de facto Kaine doctrine on the future of military force in general as potentially deployed by the United States. But that was, I think, the clearest statement I have heard on the nature of the debate inside the United States legislative branch, and I think it is something that was important to air. Hossein Zebawi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iraq, the floor is yours.